I did not begin this investigation intending to accuse American history of forgetting how to build its own cities. I simply wanted to understand why so many vintage photographs of Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco showed something that modern engineering insists should not exist. Enormous airships hovering directly over buildings still under construction, as calmly as if they were ordinary cranes. At first, I dismissed them the way any reasonable person would. Perhaps they were early advertising stunts, elaborate backdrops, or whimsical illustrations mistaken for documentary images. Yet, the deeper I dug into municipal archives and engineering journals from the 1880s through the 1910s, the more a single, unsettling pattern emerged. These were not isolated curiosities. There were hundreds of such photographs, and in them, the dirigibles were never shown transporting passengers, circling parades, or hovering idly above the skyline. They were always working. In image after image from Chicago's boom years, immense cigar-shaped craft sat almost motionless above exhibition halls, train terminals, and monumental civic buildings, precisely aligned over domes, towers, and massive, prefabricated sections suspended on cables that descended from the gondolas. Workers clustered below on surprisingly fragile-looking scaffolds, guiding pieces into place that weighed far more than any practical crane of the era could have safely lifted in a dense urban environment. Captions, when present at all, were dry and matter-of-fact. Placement of central dome, May 1892. Installation of tower crown, October 1893. Not a word about the flying machine that made those feats possible. St. Louis records showed the same thing. During the construction of exhibition palaces and public buildings around the turn of the century, airships hang directly above central spans and domes, their cables taut, their gondolas bristling with rigging. The photographs were taken by city engineers, not newspaper artists, and filed alongside structural drawings and material inventories as if these craft were nothing more exotic than scaffolds and pulleys. In San Francisco, archival prints from the 1890s and early 1900s documented vast structures rising with such speed that the official timelines already strain credibility. Yet, in certain frames, if you look beyond the celebrated facades and busy streets, you see it again. A silent shape above the roofline, tethered not to a mooring mast, but directly to the building itself. The strangest thing is not that these images exist, but that no one talks about what they show. Engineering journals of the period dissect brick bonds, mortar mixtures, and truss designs with excruciating detail. Yet when you reach the section where the illustrations plainly depict dirigible-like craft holding multi-ton components in mid-air, the text grows evasive or simply ignores the obvious. It is as if the authors themselves considered the machines so commonplace they were beneath comment, or as if someone editing those texts later decided some parts of the record should remain unspoken. When I attempted to trace the manufacturing history of these construction airships, the trail evaporated almost immediately. There are no surviving detailed patents for high-capacity aerial lifting dirigibles in the United States from that era that match what the photographs show. No production records from major factories, no catalogs offering aerial cranes to large contractors, no training manuals for rigging crews who supposedly spent decades relying on them above crowded American streets. Instead, there are vague references, occasional euphemisms, atmospheric lifting apparatus, overhead placement systems, and then, suddenly, nothing. By 1912, the images stop, not gradually, as newer technology replaces an older standard, but abruptly. One year, the skies above American construction sites bristle with cables descending from massive airships. The next year, nearly identical projects are inexplicably handled using ground-based cranes, heavier foundations, and far slower methods. On paper, the cranes become more advanced. In the photographs, the work becomes cruder and more constrained. The atmosphere is suddenly removed from the equation, and no one bothers to explain why. We are left with an uncomfortable question. How can an engineering solution so widely used From Chicago's fairgrounds to St. Louis exhibition halls to San Francisco's monumental public buildings, vanish almost overnight from both practice and memory. And why, in a country that endlessly celebrates its own innovations, is there almost no trace in our textbooks of a period when American cities quite literally rose with the help of the sky? Part 2. Chicago, a city built with the sky as scaffolding. If there is any city where you would expect a proud, detailed record of every technological trick used during its explosive growth, it is Chicago. The city has never been shy about documenting its own ambition. Yet, when you carefully examine the surviving construction photographs of its late 19th century boom, a disturbing inconsistency appears between what the images show and what the written history is willing to admit. The building campaigns leading up to and around the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 were immense in scope and speed. Official accounts emphasize steel frames, modular parts, and innovative scheduling. But some of the most revealing photographs, those rarely reproduced in popular histories, capture something that simple modular assembly cannot fully explain. In several frames, whole sections of ornate facades, domes, and towers appear as single, unified pieces being lowered from above, not assembled course by course from scaffolding. Their joints are too clean, edges too crisp, surfaces too finished for on-site fabrication in Chicago's wind-swept, muddy lots. In those same images, large airships hover directly above these components, their shapes almost uniform from project to project. Elongated bodies of consistent proportions, gondolas slung beneath with intricate rigging arrays, cables dropping to attach at specific standardized anchor points on the architectural modules. It is as though both the buildings and the aerial machines were designed as parts of a single, integrated system. The airships are not improvisations. They look like dedicated tools tuned to a construction methodology we no longer practice. Consider the logistics of placing a colossal dome atop a structure in the 1890s using only ground-based equipment. You require massive towers, heavy counterweights, clear ground all around for guy lines and support, and extraordinary care to keep everything stable in wind. Yet the built-up neighborhoods around many Chicago construction sites left little such space. Somehow, domes still went up in mere weeks, not the drawn-out schedules you would expect from purely terrestrial cranes of that era. The airship cranes offer a simple explanation. With vertical lift from above, you bypass half the mechanical obstacles. The sky becomes your scaffolding. Yet try to find a detailed engineering breakdown of atmospheric drift compensation, ballast management, or gas expansion control for those construction dirigibles in Chicago's technical literature. You encounter, at best, scattered hints, figures showing load calculations without clearly specifying the lifting platform, notes about external overhead support in margin scribbles, occasional references to confidential suppliers whose catalogs no longer exist. For a technology supposedly too impractical to be used for precision construction, it appears with suspicious regularity in visual records of some of Chicago's most demanding building projects. Even more puzzling is the silence that follows. As steel-frame skyscrapers proliferate in the early 20th century, you would expect airships to remain part of the lifting arsenal if they truly were as effective as the photos suggest. Instead, the narrative jumps straight from rudimentary cranes to incrementally improved derricks and tower cranes, as though the sky had never been enlisted at all. When you align this with reports, from other cities and even other countries, of similarly standardized airships performing nearly identical roles, the pattern looks less like local experimentation and more like a shared, inherited technology briefly applied in Chicago before being replaced by something less efficient but more controllable from the ground. And when entire sections of technical archives from that period turn out to be missing, reclassified, or reduced to vague indexes of lost data, the question becomes unavoidable. Was Chicago's airborne construction capacity truly abandoned because it failed, or because someone decided it should never be part of the story of how America learned to build tall? Part 3. St. Louis and the Forgotten Fair in the Sky. If Chicago reveals the scale of the technology, St. Louis exposes just how normalized it once was. During the Great Exposition era, American cities raced to outdo one another with spectacular temporary palaces, grand arches, and monumental halls. Official histories dwell on symbolism, civic pride, and architectural style, but gloss over the logistics of erecting such enormous structures on tight timelines and limited sites. St. Louis is a case study in that omission. Examination of lesser-known photographic collections from the city's turn-of-the-century building campaigns yields an almost uncanny déjà vu. Once again, enormous, lighter-than-air craft lingered directly above key sites during critical phases. The lifting of roof trusses longer than any available rail cars, the placement of mechanical crowns on towers, the positioning of ornate pediments as single intact pieces. The airships in St. Louis match, in dimension and configuration, those seen over Chicago projects of the same decade. Same proportions, same rigging style, same preferred positions relative to the building footprint. In several images, workers seem far more concerned with guiding the suspended elements than with the airship itself. No one is staring up as if at a spectacle. No protective ropes separate crowds from some dangerous experiment. The dirigible crane is treated, at least in the photographic moment, as a routine part of the job. And that may be the most disturbing detail of all. This was once ordinary. Ordinary enough that the record keepers did not bother to explain it for us. Yet when you consult the official engineering reports associated with these projects, the aerial presence evaporates. Diagrams sometimes omit the actual method of final placement, leaving an awkward gap between assembly completed and structure topped out. Descriptions that should logically discuss lifting strategies instead drift into generic language about innovative methods or proprietary systems. You see the shadows of the airship's work, the improbably fast timelines, the clean interfaces between prefabricated sections, the lack of massive scaffolding foundations, but not the machines themselves. What makes St. Louis particularly important is its position along the Mississippi and its role as a junction between older river infrastructure and newer electrical and railroad grids. If you entertain the idea that these construction airships were part of a broader, inherited system of building, perhaps connected to the speculative atmospheric networks hinted at by certain anomalous buildings, then a city like St. Louis becomes more than just another fairground. It becomes a node, a place where pre-existing technological traditions intersected with America's push toward modernity. And then, just as in Chicago, the sky goes quiet. After roughly 1910 to 1912, airships appear in St. Louis photographs primarily as curiosities, military experiments, or advertising novelties, not as precision lifting platforms. The same engineering culture that had apparently mastered the art of holding multi-ton components steady in mid-air suddenly reverts to explaining why such things are impractical due to wind shear and stability issues. The technology does not visibly decline. It is simply reclassified, from workhorse to impossibility. If this were merely an American story, one might blame local fashion or policy. But similar visual and documentary patterns appear in other countries during the same narrow time window. Identical airship forms, identical rigging, identical roles in construction, and then synchronous disappearance from the practical record. St. Louis, in this sense, is not an outlier. It is a necessary piece of a larger puzzle, evidence that entire American cities once treated the sky as a structural partner, and then quietly agreed to pretend they never did. Part 4. San Francisco, the fares, and the precision that should not have been possible. San Francisco's story adds a different kind of evidence, not just the presence of construction airships, but the unsettling absence of the intermediate steps we would expect from a supposedly emerging technology. In other fields, you see clear progression, cruder prototypes, experimental failures, gradual improvements. In the case of the aerial construction craft appearing over American cities, the photographic record suggests something else entirely, a system arriving fully formed, used with confidence, and then abandoned before leaving a visible trail of development. Around the time of San Francisco's major expositions and civic building campaigns in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, large-scale construction dominated reclaimed land, unstable soils, and constrained coastal sites. Ground-based lifting equipment on such terrain was expensive and risky, yet the monumental domes, arches, and exhibition halls rose with astonishing speed and precision. In many archival photographs, the structures seem to leap through their phases. No gradual growth of brick courses or steel skeletons, but sudden appearances of complete sections being lowered into place. Again, certain images reveal the missing mechanism. Above an almost complete pavilion, an airship hangs in perfect alignment, cables descending to a vast roof segment that appears too intact and too finished to have been assembled on the exposed, windswept site. In another, a tower crown, intricate, heavy, bristling with ornament, is being swung into position not from a neighboring scaffold, but from directly above, its support lines vanishing into a shadowed mass of gas envelope and rigging. What stands out in San Francisco is how seamlessly these aerial operations mesh with a broader pattern of prefabrication. Shipping manifests from the period occasionally hint at architectural elements, arriving at the port without clear indication of their origin. These were recorded as cargo, nothing more. Meanwhile, photographs show those same sorts of elements arriving already unified and ready to be installed from the sky. That suggests not just advanced lifting technology, but a supply chain capable of producing enormous, precisely engineered modules off-site and coordinating their delivery with available airship cranes overhead. Yet, when you follow the paper trail forward in time, it fractures. The companies that should have advertised their ability to provide such modular wonders leave behind no glowing catalogs of sky-ready components. The schools that should have trained engineers in aerial rigging leave no textbooks on atmospheric stabilization. San Francisco's own records, which once briefly acknowledged unusual construction methods and unexplained efficiencies, quietly shift their tone in the decades after 1910. What once read like a factual description of an obvious process becomes retrospective myth-making about brute labor, scaffolding, and hard-won triumphs against gravity and weather. If you insist on viewing all of this through the narrow keyhole of what our official engineering history allows, you are forced into increasingly implausible contortions. The airships were promotional illusions, the cables were misinterpreted shadows, the prefabricated components were somehow lifted by under-documented ground machinery, and the consistency of design among airships across continents was mere coincidence. But if you widen the frame just slightly, if you entertain the possibility that American cities briefly made use of a far older, more refined airborne construction technology, they become legible in an instant. In that context, San Francisco's expositions look less like singular triumphs of improvisation and more like the last spectacular deployments of a system the builders themselves may not have fully understood. They followed a recipe inherited rather than invented, using airships and prefabricated pieces as tools without owning the underlying blueprint. And when the time came for that blueprint to be removed from circulation, the city's soaring complexes remained, but the knowledge of how they truly went up did not. Part 5. How an entire technology vanishes from the books. Why would any civilization willingly abandon such an advantage? That is the question that transforms this from a curiosity about old photographs into a deeply troubling inquiry about how history is written and erased. From a purely practical standpoint, aerial construction dirigibles offered three critical benefits to rapidly growing American cities. First, they decoupled lifting capacity from ground conditions. Chicago mud, St. Louis riverfront, San Francisco's reclaimed shoreline, all ceased to be obstacles when the weight came from above, not from sprawling towers sunk into uncertain soil. Second, they enabled true three-dimensional prefabrication. You could fabricate entire sections in controlled environments, then simply fly them into place. Third, they dramatically shortened construction timelines, allowing cities to transform skylines in years rather than decades. The disadvantages, if we accept the narrative of their disappearance at face value, are said to be weather sensitivity, risk, and cost. Yet that explanation collapses when we remember how long lighter-than-air craft remained viable for other uses, how eagerly militaries experimented with them, and how stubbornly inefficient some ground-based cranes remained well into the 20th century. If weather alone doomed the construction airship, why did it not similarly doom every other aerial application of the era? There is another pattern, harder to dismiss. In the same decades when these dirigible cranes abruptly vanish from photographs and manuals, we find repeated signals in municipal archives, in engineering school catalogs, in patent registries, of deliberate narrowing. Entire categories of atmospheric systems, aerial lifting methods, and related courses disappear from curricula without replacement. Patents filed for overhead lifting using buoyant craft are lost in suspicious fires or reclassified under national security headings that remain opaque even now. Photographs in public collections show visible physical damage exactly where their rigging details would have been most informative. If this were merely technological obsolescence, we would expect a trail, debates over safety, reports of accidents, proposals for safer alternatives, gradual phase-outs, partial survivals in niche industries. Instead, there is something closer to a coordinated silence. The airships do not slowly fall out of favor. They are written out. Construction case studies quietly stop mentioning them. New editions of manuals omit entire sections. Lecturers who once taught aerial placement methods shift their careers or vanish from faculty rosters. Future generations of engineers grow up believing such systems were never practical in the first place. At that point, the question becomes less, why did the technology fail? And more, who needed it to be forgotten? A society that believes it clawed its way upward through slow, incremental improvements is easier to control than one that remembers inheriting capabilities it did not create. A city that thinks its domes and towers rose through sweat alone will demand less explanation than one whose skyline was assembled by machines no one can reproduce. Whether you subscribe to deeper theories of an older, erased civilization whose methods were briefly repurposed, or you prefer a more conventional story of suppressed experimental technology, the effect is the same. A class of machines, the construction airships that helped Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, and other American cities leap into modernity, was not simply retired. It was sculpted out of memory, leaving behind only architectural anomalies and stubborn photographs that refuse to fully cooperate with the official version of events. Part 6. When the sky stops helping, and the ground forgets. So we return to the central question. Why does an entire technology disappear from engineering textbooks and archives, leaving only shadows in photographs and structures that do not quite make sense without it? One answer is psychological. Our historical narrative prefers continuity, gradual improvement, and clear lines of credit. A technology that arrives fully formed, works almost too well, and then vanishes does not fit that story. It suggests inheritance instead of invention, interruption instead of progress. Accepting the reality of construction airships that exceeded the documented engineering of their period would force us to admit there are chapters missing from America's technological autobiography. Most institutions will do almost anything to avoid that. Another answer is strategic. Any technology that allows rapid reconfiguration of cities from above is inherently political. Airborne cranes are not just tools, they are powers. They allow whoever controls them to reshape infrastructure without reliance on large, visible ground operations. If such systems were, in fact, relics of an earlier, more integrated atmospheric engineering network, as some of the more speculative evidence hints, then removing them from public use and public memory would be a logical step for any authority seeking to monopolize control over space, power, and the story of how the modern world was built. Finally, there is the most unsettling answer. That erasure itself is part of a recurring pattern. We see hints of lost or buried infrastructure beneath American cities, of inexplicable precision in supposedly primitive foundations, of sudden shifts in what engineers are allowed to talk about. Against that backdrop, the disappearance of construction dirigibles is not an isolated mystery, but one thread in a larger tapestry of forgetting. A reminder that our textbooks are not neutral mirrors of the past, but carefully curated narratives shaped by what earlier generations chose or were compelled to leave out. What remains today are cities that bear the fingerprints of a technology they officially never used. Chicago's improbable timelines, St. Louis's sky-touched exhibition palaces, San Francisco's precisely placed domes and crowns, the photographs that survived culling, damage, and neglect, the uneasy feeling that our built environment is aging evidence of a conversation between earth and sky that we no longer know how to resume. We walk through these places on our lunch breaks, glance up at their silhouettes against the clouds, and congratulate ourselves on how far we have come. But if you look closely at certain angles, if you trace the lines where massive pieces once met the air, you may notice something disquieting. The buildings still remember the days when the sky helped raise them. We, somehow, do not.